Welcome, bienvenidos. Hello everyone, welcome. So I just wanted to say before we begin, I want to ask those of you who have a preference for the Spanish language to click on the globe on the bottom right of your screen within Zoom, just as it shows. Let's see, I don't see the globe at the bottom yet, but it will be there momentarily. Your interpreters are Luis and Andres, whom are excellent interpreters, and I don't want you to miss their translation if you need it. So we hope you have a very smooth and productive experience. Antes de comenzar, quiero pedirles a aquellos de ustedes que prefieren el idioma en español que hagan clic en el globo mundial en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla y tablero dentro del Zoom. Sus traductores son Luis y Andrés y son excelentes traductores. Favor de comentar en el espacio chat en su idioma preferida durante la sesión. Espero que sea una experiencia sumamente fácil y productiva. En otras palabras, el globo que está a la derecha de la pantalla es donde usted puede encontrar su idioma preferida. Okay. We also want to create space today to acknowledge this is Tongva land, but these statements are only a stepping stone to recognize the broken treaties to the native people of the sacred land. I honor them as my ancestors and respect and value the many ways their cultural heritage and beliefs continue to manifest today. And they are here to remind us all about the sacred and spiritual relationship that has always existed on this land. We acknowledge the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of LA Basin and the Southern Channel Islands. Awishko, Mahili, Atamen, thank you, ancestors. Good evening, and thank you for joining the Climate Equity LA series on equitable building and home decarbonization. I am Marta Segura, the founding director of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office at the City of LA. We have a treat for you with amazing presenters, and also we want to hear from you. Feel free to use the chat space to post questions and comments in English or Spanish. We will also post the program for the series in the chat space. I want to thank the Liberty Hill Foundation, our lead partner, for helping us create and execute this three-part series. I want to thank the anchor organizations like CBE, Scope, PSRLA, Pacoima Beautiful, Lane, the LEAP LA Coalition, and our allies like NCSA and UCLA and so many others who are facilitating and note-taking tonight and helping to promote the series. I also want to thank our Curriculum Design Committee. We collaborate and engage at all levels because climate and pollution don't recognize borders, and we must be as seamless as possible in the execution of our policies and our communication. So I want to begin with asking, why must we center the city's climate policies with equity and health at the forefront? Why we aren't only addressing climate equity because it's the morally right thing to do. If we don't address it, then we won't have a climate or a planet to save. We just can't achieve climate goals while an extractive economy continues to flourish without equity as a through line. We have learned the lesson of false solutions and consequences from poorly designed policies, right? It has happened one too many times not to learn that lesson. So right now I'd like to go to the slides on vision and purpose. Ray, I know I just started, but I want to skip my introduction because I think I told everybody who I was. But if we go to vision and purpose, that green slide right before, that would be fantastic. Great. So CEMO, which is the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, is dedicated to building collaborative, innovative, intersectional, and equitable climate solutions within the city, and also external to the city with our communities to create community resilience and limit the climate-related health burdens for all, with a laser focus on frontline communities. Next. Next, Ray. Okay, great. Well, you know what? Let's just go over the blueprint. This is our blueprint, and our blueprint basically is an innovative governance model that has helped raise community voices to assure that we develop a collaborative governance structure with our community stakeholders in the city of Los Angeles. We want to create agency and leadership in our communities to create systems change. However, to create systems change, it requires a unified approach from all people at all levels. The model we are creating prioritizes resident identified needs, giving community members much more ownership over policies such as the electrification of new low-income and middle-income homes, identifying financing for retrofits in older and existing buildings, and creating a local workforce that transitions from an oil-based economy to a renewable energy economy. And as you can probably see from the blueprint, we start off by doing like focus groups and community engagement with our frontline communities. Then we ensure that we create curriculum and focus groups based on those conversations. And then that moves along where we gather and analyze the data that we collect from the Climate Equity LA series and the focus groups that accompany it and the surveys and the data that accompanies it. And that leads us to this report with recommendations and findings that our policy and research teams deliberate on to produce a final report that goes to the Climate Emergency Mobilization Commission. And the Climate Emergency Mobilization Commission specifically represents the most pollution burdened areas of LA as identified by the state's CalEnviro screen tool, which has helped us identify areas that in LA have been historically marginalized, disinvested in, and pollution burdened. We wanted to reflect those community members in our commission so that they are experiencing the same as our frontline communities and can, through that lived experience and that wisdom, reflect upon the recommendations and findings that are being brought to them. Once that commission, which represents also labor, youth, local indigenous tribes, and climate experts, once they deliberate on those recommendations and findings, they will deliver that as a report to the LA City Council, and the LA City Council will use those recommendations and findings to create and shape equitable climate policy. So this is really our secret sauce and what makes our model unique. We're not just having awareness building or educational workshops and sessions. We're actually collecting information through these sessions and through separate processes to create these reports that will help shape policy. And that is really the essence of what our office is attempting to do, to ensure that those voices are lifted through a very innovative governance model that we hope can be replicated not just within the city, but other cities and across the state and perhaps the nation. Because we can't have continued policies that are status quo that don't consider community wisdom. So in summary, we want to create meaningful engagement and civic-led governance. We want to help shape recommendations for equitable climate policies, and we want to co-coordinate, collaborate with city leaders to bring an equity lens to LA's policies and LA's Green New Deal, and engage and mobilize the community to do so, and deliver an equitable climate action roadmap that will help us shape those policies. Now I'd like to review the agenda and the goals of today. So today's workshop is on why decarbonize buildings and what is it exactly. We want to convey the goals of the sessions as they fit into the city processes, establish a connection between building decarbonization and climate equity and health. We want to establish an understanding of how cities measure, manage building decarbonization, and also identify the top questions from the audience about decarbonization and zero carbon goals while building equity into the policy formula. And we'll start with what we're doing right now, the welcome and introductions, and then we'll go to our first presentation with Alex Jassett. Chelsea Kirk could not be here with us tonight, but Alex Jassett from Psrla will present to you on the introduction to building decarbonization, or the decarbonization of buildings and homes. And then we'll go to Megan Ross, the mayor's climate policy advisor, and she will review with us how the city of LA proposes to move forward with building decarbonization and what it has done thus far. We will then go into a Q&A session, and then directly after the Q&A session, we're going to have Kristen Pauling from LA County, Chief Sustainability Office, and Megan Ross again from the Mayor's the Mayor's Chief Sustainability Office, review the decarbonization policy examples in LA County and across the state. And then Andres will review a Q&A with you. And then we'll go into breakout sessions where all the conversation will happen. You'll have a facilitator and a note taker. And then we'll come back with a share back and summarize with announcements and sign off. So that's pretty much the flow for today and who will be speaking and what our goals are. So I hope that that's pretty clear. So now that I've done all that, I'd like to introduce you to Alex Jassett from Psrla, Physicians for Social Responsibility, who will be talking to us today about the basics of building decarbonization. Alex?
Thanks, Marta. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm very honored to be participating in this series, which has been a long time in the works, and I'm very appreciative of Marta for inviting me to share some of our work with you all. As Marta mentioned, my name is Alex Jassett, and I'm the Nuclear and Energy Justice Program Manager at Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles. This evening, I will be outlining what building decarbonization is, what an energy justice framework for building decarbonization looks like, and why it's important. I was hoping to give this presentation with my colleague Chelsea Kirk at Strategic Actions for a Just Economy, who's an expert on the housing and tenant concerns, but she was unfortunately not feeling well, so I'll be covering her slides tonight. That being said, we're both happy to answer any questions or any follow-up that I can't get to tonight via email. So before we get into details, it's important to understand what we mean by energy justice. Our coalitions, the LEAP LA Coalition and the Repower LA Coalitions, worked collaboratively to create an energy justice framework that seeks to address historic and current injustices created by past and present policy. It seeks to avoid the unintended consequences of rushed legislation. It lays out a vision for clean, affordable, and accessible energy for all. It recognizes the importance of taking leadership from frontline, Indigenous, and low-income communities who know the local issues best. It prioritizes environmental justice principles and works to create a participatory democracy with deep community engagement and policy design. And finally, it addresses the urgency of the climate crisis while understanding the importance of collaboration with tenants, workers, Indigenous communities, environmental justice communities, low-income folks, and other often overlooked stakeholders. So before we discuss what building decarbonization is, I want to quickly explain how our energy justice framework translates to building decarbonization. To us, this means that whatever approach we take towards building decarbonization should not lead to evictions, rent burden, energy burden, harassing conduct against tenants, or displacement. It should not replace carbon-based infrastructure with technologies that create other air, environmental, or climate pollutants, as we've seen from some false solutions that are being proposed currently. We also believe that it should equitably distribute the benefits and burdens of the energy transition. It should ensure that decarbonization technologies and information are accessible and affordable to everyone, and that it ensures that the communities with the worst pollution and climate burdens reap the full benefits. It also should be informed and shaped by the needs and priorities of local communities and experts, leveraging local networks and expertise to ensure that equitable and effective adoption of policies and programs. It should create jobs that are well paid and unionized, and use targeted local hiring to ensure a just transition for workers from impacted industries, as well as historically excluded communities. And finally, it should ensure that energy efficiency improvements decrease the energy burdens and provide real bill savings at no additional cost. We can go on to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Well, I'll wait for the next, oh, there we go. So as, I think back one more. One more. There we go. So as many of us know, Los Angeles is in a climate emergency. Each year there are more wildfires, record-breaking summer heat, drought, and rising sea levels. These hazards are becoming more frequent and severe because of global warming, and in order to address them, we must drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So buildings are a critical place to start in Los Angeles because buildings are the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in our city. Buildings, both commercial and residential, are responsible for 46% of the city's greenhouse gas emissions. So if we focus on efforts to reduce building emissions through building decarbonization, we'll be targeting the largest source responsible for emissions in the city, which again is almost half of all emissions in the city. So how do buildings produce greenhouse gas emissions? Buildings produce them in two different ways. One is through direct building emissions. Buildings release carbon dioxide directly when they use equipment that relies on combustion. So those are things like gas appliances, water heaters, wall heaters, stoves, ovens. And then there's also indirect building emissions, and these come from the energy source itself. So for example, if the electricity supply coming into your house from the grid is powered by fossil fuels, those would be indirect building emissions, as well as embodied carbon, which are all the emissions that are produced during the construction of a building before it becomes operational. So now we can get into the sort of main question, which is what is building decarbonization? So decarbonizing a building means to reduce and eventually remove its carbon footprint. So there's three components to this. The first is energy efficiency, which is just reducing the amount of energy needed to operate a building. So doing the same amount of stuff with less energy. The other is electrification, which involves replacing natural gas appliances with all electric appliances. So getting rid of those things that I mentioned before, stoves and wall heaters and water heaters. And then the final is by moving our grid and our energy sources to carbon-free energy sources like solar and wind. So we can just quickly go through some energy efficiency measures. The first one is just upgrading lighting to LED light bulbs that require less energy. The second is building enclosure improvements, like replacing wall insulation with a material that will better resist heat loss. The third is replacing old windows with windows that prevent air leakage and keep warm or cool air in. And then as for electrification, this involves replacing natural gas appliances with electric ones. So for example, gas-powered ovens, stoves, water heaters, and space heaters would be replaced with electric appliances. And then finally, moving the grid towards carbon-free energy sources. So clean energy is energy that comes from renewable, zero-emission sources that do not pollute the atmosphere when used. Energy saved by energy efficiency measures is also included in this category. And some clean energy sources that you might be familiar with include solar and wind. So while building decarbonization can be used to eliminate the largest source of carbon emissions in the city, there are also some community concerns and questions that need to be addressed if we're going to do this equitably. These include environmental justice concerns, housing and tenant concerns, as well as labor concerns. So we can start with environmental justice, which is my specialty. And we can, and so we can talk about the opportunities first, which in terms of just in addition to eliminating the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the city, what are some of the other environmental justice opportunities that this transition offers? The first is pairing decarbonization with other retrofits, which can decrease the cost and improve housing quality, including poor indoor air quality that leads to health problems. So gas appliances that are producing indoor air quality impacts that are leading to things like respiratory issues and asthma. Second, decarbonization policies can be used to address injustices of past and present policy by acknowledging that some communities have historically borne the brunt of our energy system and making sure that those communities have a strong say in how we move forward. Third, decarbonization can also be used to help us reimagine what energy ownership and distribution look like. So systems can be designed to be smaller or have collective or public ownership, shifting costs and benefits and burdens again. And then finally, we also have an opportunity to design policy differently through the CEMO process that we're all taking part in right now, which prioritizes deep community engagement and is already serving as a model to other jurisdictions. So as for environmental justice risks, we know that a disparity in access will lead to a disparity in outcomes. We've seen this through solar and EV programs that prioritize wealthy early adopters and homeowners which concentrates the benefits in those same communities. So we need to design policy smarter so that we're making sure that people have access right at the beginning. We also know that communities need to be at the design table from inception to implementation to catch potential issues and help design the policy with local specificity, which is often critical to the success of a program. We must also avoid false solutions that sacrifice local air or water quality for carbon reductions, some of which are currently being proposed throughout the state of California. And we also know that ignoring energy efficiency will increase burdens on environmental justice and low-income communities. The less efficient our system is, the more infrastructure we'll need, which increases the land use and environmental impacts for communities across the city. So as for housing justice, building decarbonization similarly presents opportunities and many risks for tenants in LA. So we can talk about those now. So some of the opportunities include lower energy bills. So if we use deep energy efficiency retrofits, that could result in real energy bill savings for tenants. And that's significant when you consider that 21% of renters in Los Angeles are energy burdened, which means that they spend more than 6% of their income on energy. It can also lead to improved health outcomes. As I said before, natural gas appliances are polluting and can cause health problems like respiratory issues and asthma. And gas leakages can lead to fatal explosions or carbon monoxide poisoning. And having all electric appliances in the home will eliminate many of those risks. It can also lead to climate resilient homes. So a lot of housing in LA, especially older housing, is not in a condition to withstand the impacts of climate change, like extreme temperatures. So decarbonization retrofits will make homes more resilient to the effects of climate change. And then finally, it will also lead to better housing quality. So we could pair building retrofits with decarbonization to include the remediation of hazardous conditions such as asbestos, and thereby minimize the disruption for tenants while maximizing the benefits for those same tenants. So now for some of the housing risks. So some of the risks include rent increases and greater rent burden for households, displacement for low-income tenants, an increase in harmful landlord practices like harassment, and then finally, greater corporate ownership of housing. We can go back. Yeah, thank you. And so there's also risks that exist because decarbonization is expensive. So a decarbonization retrofit can surpass $28,000 per housing unit when considering the price for all new electric appliances, energy efficiency improvements, gas disconnection, possible panel upgrades, and labor costs. So under existing law, tenants, even those who are rent controlled, could be left footing the bill due to existing cost recovery programs that allow landlords to recoup costs for certain building upgrades. And right now, tenants are in no position to absorb these costs, especially not at the moment when most tenants in LA are rent burdened and many have lost income due to the pandemic. So now we can move on to worker justice. So there are some tremendous opportunities to get this right and ensure that jobs gained from this transition are similar to or higher quality than the ones that are lost. And we can, yeah, there we go. First and foremost, there's a huge potential for new jobs. So an $80 million annual investment for 5 years could decarbonize and upgrade all of LA's public schools and create 400 to 500 time equivalent union construction jobs per year. And if we took that even further and we did a deep decarbonization of LA's affordable housing sector, that could create between 46 and 7,400 full-time equivalent union construction jobs per year. So there's a lot of potential for job increases here. Secondly, there's also a variety of jobs that are available to displaced workers from the oil and gas industries who would need to be transitioned into other careers. Or theoretically into an early retirement if that's something that makes sense. Third, it's also important to center the worker concerns early in the process because of the way that we can design policies and set strong labor protections now could in fact set the emerging industry standards so that across the board and across the state, these would be producing good quality jobs and prioritizing worker protections. And then finally, targeted hiring of displaced workers and those in frontline, disadvantaged, and historically excluded communities can help preserve and create jobs in an equitable way. And so, yeah, so now we can talk about some of the risks with labor. And some of the biggest risks that have been identified by our coalition partners concerned displaced workers from the oil and gas industry and what can be done to make sure that these workers can transition with dignity to either retirement or new fields, depending on their age, skills, and experience. There's also a serious concern about the quality of jobs in the renewable energy sector and the building decarbonization sector. As these are relatively new fields, there are similarly relatively few protections for them. And so we need to ensure that the jobs we create by this transition aren't lower quality than the ones that workers have right now. Okay, so to wrap up, why is an energy justice framework necessary? Hopefully the presentation has answered that question in a little bit more detail. But just to summarize, without a comprehensive community-led approach, the proposed solutions will inevitably lead to unintended consequences for the most vulnerable communities. However, if we use this opportunity, as we currently are, to design policy differently with community at the center, we can rectify past injustices, increase labor protections, improve indoor air quality, and keep people housed, all while eliminating the largest source of greenhouse gases in the city. And so this concludes my presentation, and I thank you all for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Alex. That was a really great introduction to an equitable approach to decarbonizing buildings and homes. And thank you for highlighting some of the possible challenges but the opportunities as well, because we really need to emphasize the opportunities of making this work for everybody. So Alex has set us up really well to now introduce you to and I just want to say we're going to do Q&A, but we're going to do it after the next presentation. I want to introduce you now to Megan Ross, the Mayor's Climate Policy Advisor. And Megan has been working on this topic of decarbonizing buildings for quite some time, and she's been very instrumental with the series as well. Megan Ross, it's all yours.
Thank you, Marta. I really appreciate that. And you can go ahead and put my slides up, Ray. As we start in on this, I'm going to talk a little bit about our city's major goals and some technical information about buildings that can guide our next steps. But first, I want to offer some context and guiding thoughts. Next slide. Scientists continue to note that a 1.5-degree future where we keep global temperatures from rising to catastrophic levels is going to require major progress and rapid progress. Building decarbonization is one of our most impactful actions to achieve that future. And we need multiple solutions for our buildings because they vary in terms of energy, in terms of costs, and in terms of their readiness. So as I share our city's goals, I hope you'll think about these questions and talk about them in your breakouts perhaps. What decarbonizing actions need to come first, and what support is needed to maintain equitable decarbonizing action in the long term. Next. LA's Green New Deal is our climate action plan. It's grounded in the principles of urgent attention to avoid catastrophic impacts, in centering environmental justice and equity, in creating a fair and equitable economy that supports good jobs in the green future, and in leading by example, not just in what we do, but in how we do it in all the ways that Marta was explaining. Next. Our climate actions through this plan are grounded in what the city calls the 5 zeros across our energy grid, our built environment, our transportation sector, waste reduction, and water efficiency. And these actions all depend on each other. They're interrelated and they integrate together. Next. Alex mentioned some of why decarbonizing buildings is so important, but to reiterate, the effort of decarbonizing buildings is about clean air indoors and throughout our environment. It's about keeping costs of housing construction down. It's about lowering our climate impact by using renewable energy and carbon-free energy. It's about lowering our energy demand and our bills by keeping buildings safe in times of crisis, and about improving public health outcomes and reducing medical costs from pollution exposure. Next slide. LA's Green New Deal lists specific goals for buildings. Forgive me and my dog, who has decided now is the moment for playtime. No later than the end of this decade, all newly constructed buildings should be net zero carbon emissions in terms of the energy they consume. And no later than 2050, all buildings that are currently standing should be net zero carbon emissions in terms of the energy they consume. No. Next slide. Thanks. Building decarbonization is about three things. It's about decarbonizing our sources of energy on the grid by using renewable and carbon-free sources to generate power. It's about energy efficiency, because by optimizing and reducing energy demand, we can use less energy to begin with. It's also about electrifying everything we can so that we can leverage that carbon-free electric grid. Next. I want to explain a difference in technical terms here. People ask me this often: what is the difference between net zero and zero carbon buildings? Both of these types of buildings are highly energy efficient, first and foremost. Net zero carbon buildings use as much zero carbon energy as possible, and they use on-site renewables or offsets to make up for any carbon content of the energy they do draw. Zero carbon buildings use only carbon-free energy to operate. This is how the city's zero carbon grid and zero carbon buildings goals work together. Next. LA Department of Water and Power, our local utility, conducted a multi-year study called LA 100 that shows that we can take our electric grid carbon-free, and that decarbonizing buildings is a really big part of that. The city is planning for our electric grid to be 97% carbon-free by 2030 and 100% carbon-free by 2035. That means every all-electric building in LA would be zero carbon. For common building types, all electric systems are feasible, and we can get there with currently available technology. For some specialized building types or functions, like for manufacturing or for special industrial processes, there may not be all electric or zero carbon tech available right now, but we should be careful to make a path to get these buildings to a carbon-free future. How do we define our pathways? I think first it's important to understand our building stock, the size, type of use, their vintage or their age, how they use energy, and I'll share some of those details today. It's critically important that we understand community priorities and potential impacts, and that we seek input and solutions from those most impacted. That's what we're doing today and the rest of this month, and we'll continue to do with other city teams this spring. And from that point, we can develop policy standards and compliance paths that address our climate and community needs, including equitable alternatives, and create public-facing programs that enable everyone to participate and benefit from the energy transition. Next slide. Marta discussed this a little bit, so I don't want to belabor this point a lot, but City Council emphasized inclusive stakeholder engagement that established a link to energy and housing justice in the ways that Alex described. City Council has also named a specific policy goal for new buildings first, and pointed to this engagement process as a means for making that happen. Council's future policy requests will be accountable to this process that we're in right now. Next. These three city teams are responsible for engagement with stakeholders across the city according to their departmental mission. CEMO is out front on this. They're connecting with community and neighborhood leaders and justice-oriented advocates like yourselves. The Department of Building and Safety serves the technical community of the buildings industry, and they'll be connecting with architects and engineers, buildings workforce, building owners and managers across all building types. And the housing department will connect with multifamily housing providers and tenants, particularly those in the affordable housing space. And similar topics are going to thread through all these conversations, but with some special focus areas depending on the departmental missions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some technical info on our building stock here. The latest data that we have reflects that our buildings in Los Angeles make up 46% of total emissions in the city. Emissions are still going down every year. They've gone down a little faster in other sectors, which is why this percentage might sound high to those of you who follow this information. These numbers are from 2019. I just want to acknowledge that the 2020 numbers are really impacted by COVID, and I don't think they're indicative of real trends. But across our buildings, we've already reduced emissions a lot. We reduced 30% since 2014, right as our first climate action plan was being published, and 38% since our baseline year, which was 1990. Most of these reductions are thanks to more renewable energy on our grid, so we do need to take further action. Next. Residential buildings are not improving their emissions as much as commercial buildings. And the reason for this is because residential buildings use a much higher proportion of natural gas than commercial buildings do. We take hot showers at home, we do dishes, we heat our homes overnight as we're sleeping, which we don't do in commercial buildings. And so heating our living space and our water are commonly served by natural gas. And commercial buildings use energy very differently. They use relatively more electricity. Next slide. We do have one important ordinance on the books already to understand and monitor our building energy use. It's called the Existing Building Energy and Water Efficiency Ordinance, or EBEW. And this ordinance requires all large buildings over 20,000 square feet to benchmark or report their energy and water use every year. And all city buildings that are medium-sized or 7,500 square feet or larger must do the same. And this tells us a lot about energy use intensity per square foot, or EUI, and as well as about carbon dioxide emissions from that energy use. And although this policy tool offers us great information about our buildings, it's not getting us the change that we need in decarbonizing buildings for our future goals. Next slide. So the Mayor's Office has received support from technical experts at the Building Electrification Institute and their partners to understand our building stock and energy use. The BEI is a small but experienced organization focused on building technical capacity and equitable approaches to helping cities through the energy transition for buildings. And they combed through many data sources, including they carefully combed through this EBEW reported energy data to come up with a report that will be published this month. I'm going to preview some of those findings for you today. Next. We have almost 1 million buildings in Los Angeles, and 70% of these are single-family homes. If you count multifamily buildings of all sizes, about 90% of all individual buildings in Los Angeles are residential. That's on the left side chart. On the right side chart, by building area, the trends shift a little bit, and commercial buildings take up a much larger share. About half of our building floor area is in small buildings like single-family homes and up to fourplexes. 19% of our building floor area are from larger multifamily buildings of 5 or more units. More than 30% of our building floor area comes from these relatively large non-residential buildings like commercial buildings, institutional, industrial, and government buildings. Next slide. Oh, good. So our current EBEW ordinance categorizes buildings by size as well, not just by type. And according to this inventory, looking at the categories of large, medium, and small, about 25,000 individual buildings fit into this large size category, which is about 1/3 of the total area. About 27,000 individual buildings are medium sized. And again, these categories I'm roughly defining according to the way that our EBEW ordinance defines them. We have more than 900,000 small buildings in Los Angeles. Most of these are single family homes, but not all of them. Looking more closely at medium and large buildings, which our current ordinance already defines and accounts for, nearly half of these are multifamily buildings, and the other half are a mix of commercial, industrial, and institutional buildings. And these building types, as I mentioned before, use energy differently and are expected to decarbonize differently. I'll leave you with a couple of takeaways. First is the largest 3% of buildings in Los Angeles use almost 30% of our energy citywide, and they take up about a third of the building floor area. This small number of buildings have an outsized impact on our carbon consumption. And next, decarbonizing buildings according to size would have very different impacts on carbon reduction. Decarbonizing large buildings would affect lots of buildings and lots of floor area, but not a whole lot of our estimated gas usage. Large and medium buildings would affect just over 50,000 individual buildings in the city, almost half of our building area, maybe about a quarter of our estimated gas usage. So to truly meet our climate goals, we will need to find a way to decarbonize small buildings and single-family homes, which account for an estimated 78% of natural gas usage throughout the city. So in summary, I hope you've learned a little more about how impactful building decarbonization is to our climate future, and acknowledge that buildings are not one size fits all. They really vary in terms of how we use them, how they use energy, what affects cost, and how ready our buildings are for change. And again, I hope you'll think about and share with us what kinds of decarbonization actions should come first in our process, and what support is needed to maintain action in the long term. Thank you so much, Marta. Back to you now, I think.
Because we have so few questions, Ray, could you bring back Alex and also Megan for the Q&A section so that we can maybe address the questions with both of our presenters? Great, thank you. So thank you both. I think we're just beginning to transfer the questions to the Google Doc and prioritize them. But why don't we go ahead and start with Allison's question. Did you say top 3% of buildings use 30% of building energy, Megan?
That's right. And so the top 3% are the largest buildings in the city. And if you look at they just represent so much more of our floor area. That's why they use so much energy, is because these are literally the largest, skyscrapers that you see in the downtown and more dense areas.
And Alex, for those of us who are less familiar with energy justice, if we were to apply energy justice to, let's say, the retrofit of either a building or a multi-unit family housing, what might that look like?
Yeah, well, it would mean a few things. One, it would mean that the labor used to do those retrofits was well paid, hopefully unionized, and like high road jobs that were equal to or better than whatever jobs were available previously. Mm-hmm. They would also make sure to pair those retrofits with other home improvements that could improve the building stock overall. They would make sure to keep bills low for people. They would make sure to avoid evictions and make sure there's strong tenant protections to make sure that costs aren't being passed down to consumers or to tenants, as well as a bunch of other community concerns being really embedded into that process. And again, that's the importance of doing the process the way that I think we're all doing right now, which is to really get deep community input from community members about these policies to know how it will most impact them.
Perfect. And Megan, if let's say we go through this process and input is taken to the commission and to city council, how would these principles and guardrails be, do you think, just in your own opinion, be translated into policy that the city creates for building decarbonization or other climate policy? What does that look like?
I think it looks like, what Alex shared about ensuring that, this kind of work supports good jobs, that there's housing protections along with that. I think that, part of what I tried to convey in some of this information and what I hope we'll discuss in the breakout groups is how to order these actions. What does it mean to equitably tackle climate emissions? Is it in the greatest consuming buildings? Is it in the least invested communities? Is it in with government buildings, with commercial buildings, with housing buildings? I think that what I've been hearing from a lot of folks in this city and what I've been seeing in other cities is that you really need a suite of policies to undertake this broad initiative effectively. And you might see different compliance mechanisms or different types of alternatives for different kinds of buildings. I think there's also not just policy tools, but programmatic tools that are incredibly important. We're going to talk more about some of those next week, I think, particularly around housing and what kinds of housing protections and impacts would be affected and could be strong complements to building decarbonization policy.
Well, I saw a couple of questions roll in, and I'll ask two of them because they're kind of related. Dan asked, what money is available for the state to get building retrofits going? And how will these retrofits, the other question, I think it's from Nish, how will these retrofits be paid for, especially in the manner such as the costs aren't passed down to the tenants? Great questions, right? Maybe I'm not supposed to answer these questions, but Alex, why don't you go ahead and start us off with what money is available by the state, and then if not, then Megan and I can take it on.
Yeah, I'd actually prefer if one of you had better expertise on that. Yeah.
No problem. I'm happy to take it. Dan, there's some money, but likely not enough at this moment. I think the state is looking to, they've invested quite a bit of money in building decarbonization efforts right now. I want to say one tenth, I think, which is it's more than what it sounds like. About 1/10 of their overall climate resilience effort is going directly to building decarbonization. There are some state incentive programs that are available. The state also has a role to play in utility regulation and setting expectations for how our energy utilities are expected to perform and transform over the years. So there's some, I guess that's my final answer is that there's some, but it needs to be complemented by other sources. And from Niche, how will the retrofits be paid for in such a manner that the costs aren't passed down? Part of how we do that now is through incentive programs. No air conditioner lasts forever. No furnace lasts forever. And so, the building owner or manager has to swap out items from time to time just to keep the building running. They need upgrades from time to time. And so there is a sense of, cost budgeting in building management around those kinds of upgrades. And what incentive programs seek to do is offset some of the costs of doing that to support clean energy. And so if you, sign up for an incentive program with DWP, or you look to get a rebate for replacing your, refrigerator to a more efficient model, that uses less energy, or swapping out your, your gas water heater for an electric one, that will, it may not reduce the cost entirely, but it would reduce it ideally enough that it's more in line with the general operating budget. I think what we hope to uncover in these conversations is more about where those needs are deepest, so that we are offsetting costs in the right places, in the right ways, and for the right measures, ensuring that we are delivering incentives in ways that accelerate a transition to clean energy and not just to not only to efficiency, but to renewables and to fully electric energy.
Absolutely, Megan. As I was just going to say that part of the purpose of these series is to ensure that we get these questions that we're seeing on the screen. Even though we may not be able to answer every question tonight, we are going to deliver these questions to the commission and to city council so that they can understand the specific concerns of how we retrofit a craftsman, how we retrofit a very low income multi-unit family housing. How do we take the funding that we have and prioritize it? Do we create new financing structures? What are the financing tools available that we may not even know of today that we could bring into the picture to ensure that we do have financing available to address the most important cases first, and then do it in a multi-phase approach so that it's systematic, it's a whole of government approach, and it's not just a piecemeal pilot approach that is helpful to inform us and to educate us on the costs. But in the long run, we really need something more systematic and that really maps the areas and the priorities that we have to address the issues that you're all bringing up in these wonderful, wonderful questions. And one of the questions I'm just looking at now, it says, does the city of LA plan to offer any programs to help with the decarbonization targets? For example, trade-in programs for gas fuel stoves, help for weatherization programs, specifically designed for the needs of the renters, and perhaps separate programs for building owners, right? That's an excellent question. Megan, would you like to comment?
Absolutely, yeah, not to step over Alex, but I don't want to put you in the spot of having to. Yes, we do have incentive programs that are already targeted to decarbonize. There are exchange programs for refrigerators, for example, not for gas fuel stoves yet. There is a lot of help for weatherization. There's a free to users direct install program called the Home Energy Improvement Program, or HYPE, H-E-I-P, that offers, like I said, free lighting upgrades, quick, simple fixes that really help improve energy efficiency and lower your bills, as well as lower carbon. And there's also a new program launching this year, the Comprehensive Affordable Multifamily Retrofits Program, or CAMR, C-A-M-R, which is specifically for buildings with income qualified tenants. You have to have a certain number of tenants in your building below the median income in order to qualify for participation. And it covers deep efficiency improvements in your building. It covers electrification swap outs, like you were saying. And it also covers a certain amount for electrical panel upgrades, which is really important for a lot of under-resourced multifamily buildings. So that, and that was also, I have to say, co-created and really instigated by a lot of community advocates, many of whom I'm sure are on this call. So I just wanted to highlight that for the value of your participation in evenings like this and subsequent meetings that we'll be having this month, that these are really important ways to illuminate these issues and these needs and these questions to the city officials that are responsible for taking this forward into the future.
Right. Before I hand it over to Alex, I just want to say that in a committee meeting for the Energy and Environment Committee, Chair Mitchell Farrell asked DWP what percentage of the budget are they allocating to CAMR, and they said that they would come back to him in a future committee meeting to answer that question. But I think maybe this question goes to Alex. I think these incentive programs and rebate programs are really great. However, how do we avoid, Alex, the trap of having incentives not reach those who most need it?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two main components to that question. One is just making sure that all of them are accessible, make sure that the information is available to people, make sure that people know where to go if they have questions about it, know how to maybe bundle some of these retrofits or use certain programs to get, multiple sort of aspects of work done at the same time. And also there's, the affordability question, making sure that communities that might not have upfront capital are still able to access these programs right from the gate with no upfront costs. I think that's a huge barrier that we've seen with a lot of programs, throughout history, that that might be, very well intended, but if people can't access them with upfront capital, then, those are the communities that get left stuck with higher bills and worse air quality. And so those are the concerns we're trying to avoid by making sure that programs and policies are designed with community at the table, and able to get that information and make sure that that accessibility is really available to everyone.
Great. And thank you so much, Alex and Megan. We've almost run out of time here, and I need to introduce the next panel, but I do want to acknowledge the questions that we did not get to, and maybe just read them through so that the folks who asked them know that they will get responded to in the future. So one of them is, I think they just got deleted from my screen. Maybe Andres, if you can put them back, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, sorry, just a little technical issue.
Technical issue. All right, then. What I'll do then is let the audience know that we will be addressing the questions that we did not address in either in a future panel or when we send you the reminders for the future series. And we will definitely be sending, somebody asked if we'll be recording this, we'll be sending you the recording and a PDF of the slides. So thank you, Alex and Megan. That was very illuminating, helpful, and we got a lot of great questions. So that's always fantastic. So now I'd like to transition us to our next panel. Our next panel is both Kristen Pauling from LA County's Chief Sustainability Office, and also we're having Megan Ross return to us from the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. So they will be highlighting some jurisdictional local policies that address this issue and how both the city and the county are approaching it. So I hope that you all enjoy this as much as I have. Great. Thank you. There's Kristen,
Thanks.
there's
Great.
Megan, and Alex is still with us. You could stay with us, Alex. That'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. If you can go ahead and put those slides up, I'll just kick it off.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Kristen? Tell folks what you do, and then Megan, you can go next as the slides come up.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Torres calling on the LA County Chief Sustainability Office. I'm so excited to be here as this regional effort to figure out how to pursue equitable climate policy is really kicking off in a big way, thanks to CEMO. So I'll hand it over to Megan, and I think we're to Megan to start off, and then I'll take it away after that.
Yeah, just wanted to say that Kristen and I are co-presenting some of these policy examples because it's so important for all levels of government to work together to reduce emissions. And the Climate Equity LA series is focused on city policy making, but we really need to work closely with the county. And we also both need to work within the framework set up by the state, which is a helpful guiding framework for us to collaborate, since Angelinos might live in the city and work elsewhere in the county or vice versa. So we're going to talk about some policy examples tonight. They're not specific proposals, but they are helpful, I hope, to consider as we plan our own next steps. So I hope you'll think about which aspects of these policy examples resonate with you. And if we applied examples like these in Los Angeles, how do you think you and your community would be affected? Kristen, over to you.
Great, thanks, Megan. Great, next slide, please. So like Megan said, this section, we're going to talk about the policy examples, what other places have done, or just sort of buckets of how those types of policies for building decarbonization, how you might approach them. But definitely do want to start off with this collaboration piece. The county and the city have worked closely together over, the last, I don't know, really since our office was created, the last 5 years, of how to really align our sustainability planning work and how to really take on some of the immediate challenges together. Because we know that so many stakeholders, like Megan said, cross boundaries every day. And these impacts certainly don't respect boundaries. So we needed to really be working together closely. So on this slide, you'll see an image, actually just the text from the county sustainability plan, like literally putting down on paper our opportunity to work together with the city of Los Angeles and other cities and other groups to think about how to pursue clean buildings and building decarbonization. And I'm also really excited to share that this afternoon, the Board of Supervisors agenda was released for this upcoming week, Tuesday, their next meeting. And it has on there a motion from Supervisors Kuehl and Mitchell entitled Ensuring the Equitable Decarbonization of Buildings. So I invite you all to go on the county website and review what that is, but it basically directs county staff, and there's several other parts of county government here this evening who will be involved in this effort to work towards building decarbonization, both from an existing buildings perspective and a new buildings perspective, and to really engage in an ongoing way with stakeholders, thinking about tenant rights organizations, energy justice organizations, a lot of the themes that you've heard here today, that the county should be pursuing them as well. And to think again about the existing buildings and new buildings and how to phase out the use of natural gas equipment and appliances in new construction as well. So I am going to this was super. I'm going to talk about the new buildings piece and then hand it over to Megan for the existing buildings piece. But this slide, we wanted to reiterate, you heard at the top the importance of looking at building emissions from a climate perspective. This chart again looks at how do we reduce our carbon emissions 80% by the year 2050. And we'll kind of step through some of the pieces. Again, renewable energy, I'm very happy to say that the county supervisors have actually approved moving forward with all areas of all unincorporated areas of Los Angeles where we have land use authority by the end of 2022, we'll be on 100% renewable energy. So we already checked that box of how we holistically define building decarbonization. The county is already very clearly, we don't have to wait very much longer to really be at 100% renewable energy. So we're super proud that now we can take this next step to think about how are we using buildings efficiently, and are we we already have that clean energy source coming into the building. So how about we move towards building decarbonization holistically? Next slide. So you saw on that previous slide the term REACH code. So I'm just going to spend a second here describing what a REACH code is. Megan mentioned that the state has a really important role here in buildings performance. So the state energy code applies to all new construction and renovation. So it sets basically a minimum standard for health, climate, and energy goals related to buildings. So that's things like lighting, that's things like insulation, that's things like faucet, windows, and doors. So there's a baseline requirements for everywhere across the state. Local governments, next slide, can go above and beyond that, and they can reach beyond the minimums. So that's what we mean by an energy REACH code. There's a rigorous process whenever a jurisdiction decides to go above the states. I'll just briefly describe that. There can be differences based on building type, number of stories. Like we've been talking about, buildings can be so unique. So there's a lot of considerations. And REACH code compliance from, like, if you're a building owner or thinking from a building user perspective, whether you're in compliance with a REACH code, if there is one that's relevant to you, that's determined at the time of a building permit is being applied for or granted. Next slide. So when we're talking building decarbonization and REACH codes, there's 3 types of policy examples that we're generally that are out there. So first in green is a natural gas infrastructure ban that effectively prohibits gas hookups in buildings. That's based on allowable emissions or an infrastructure type. And at the bottom of each of these boxes, you'll see jurisdictions that have already pursued, that already have this type of REACH code in place. So the city of San Francisco and city of Berkeley. In purple, you'll see what's described as an all electric code. So that's a very clear all electric, no natural gas appliances. You know, when you say no natural gas appliances, that can leave room for propane or biogas. And cities that have pursued this approach in purple are San Francisco and Sacramento. Now, on the right in blue is the electric preferred code. So that's our local example. The city of Santa Monica has pursued this approach where gas is still allowed, but gas appliances need to be at a higher efficiency standard than the state's minimum efficiency standards. So that incentivizes electric appliances because it can be, you know, it is more onerous to meet that standard for gas. So that's the incentive there. And like I said, locally, city of Santa Monica has this electric preferred code. Next slide. And like I said, part of the state's framework for how they consider the appropriateness of building standards is certainly cost. So the state has a program that has already studied the cost impacts of several different types of buildings and various climate zones. The entire state is mapped out and with numbers on it of what they call climate zones. And of course, considering the utilities for each area. Los Angeles County, I think we're at 9 utilities in this, just in this county alone. So these studies looked at construction costs and also utility bill costs, recognizing that those can be sort of different players who are impacted by construction costs versus utility costs. And they compared various electrification measures and against mixed fuels measures, meaning gas plus electric or any other combination of fuels. So they looked at different sort of categories of buildings, non-residential buildings, single family and low-rise residential homes, mid-rise multifamily, and high-rise multifamily. These get really complex. I personally haven't run these. They exist, and somebody has really boiled them down to some key points here. But if you want to really get in the weeds here, those weeds are available to you. Next slide. So some key takeaways from these studies. So on the left, you'll see that building type category that I described, and on the right, you'll see just a punchy version of the findings here. So again, this is on the construction side of moving to all electric and mixed fuel. So you'll see generally on the construction side across building types, it's less expensive to pursue all electric versus having natural gas infrastructure going to these types of buildings. Next slide, please. And on this slide, this describes the cost impacts to utility bills of all electric versus mixed fuel. So again, these are the same building types shown on the left, and it's a different picture. It's a more mixed picture of utility bill impacts. So let's just pick one category here to describe it, the low-rise multifamily, usually more expensive right away. Sometimes year one is slightly more expensive, but costs can go down. And this is, again, really high level summary. There's so many different variables that you could move and the results would be a little different. So if you're really interested in this, I'm sure our team would be happy to point you to the additional details. Yeah, you can see other results here. And I think this is where I pause and hand it over to Megan to just, oh, actually, no, sorry. This is one more per slide for me, and then I'll hand it over to Megan. So I described the buckets of policy that have been pursued in some places where they have been already adopted, these REACH codes. So what else should we think about when we're considering what we want here in Los Angeles for new buildings? Additional considerations, what about EV charging? What about on-site renewable generation, cool roofs, landscaping features? Those are all things that we can think about and how we should pursue building decarbonization in Los Angeles. What about embodied carbon? That's sort of the carbon it takes to actually do construction. And then timing. How can the city align with the timing so the state has its a 3-year cycle, rigid, that never changes really. And then how can jurisdictions work together on any of these facets? I'm obviously very excited about that. I wouldn't be here at a 7 p.m. meeting if we didn't think that part. So we're obviously thinking really strongly about that cooperation piece. So really, again, that was just meant to be an overview on the new buildings piece and the policy approaches that we could consider there. There's probably others, and we're really open to hearing about that in the discussion. So I'll hand it over to Megan now, next slide, to talk about existing buildings.
Thanks, Kristen. So one common way to address emissions in existing buildings is through building performance standards, or BPS policies, that require minimum levels of energy or climate performance. They usually involve conducting retrofits or other performance-based actions, often in line with your typical building maintenance schedule. Based on LA's goals, we talk about this performance in terms of carbon, or GHG emissions intensity, in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent gases per square foot, and in efficiency, or energy use intensity, or EUI, which is measured in British thermal units per square feet across any energy source, whether electric or gas or other. Next. I just want to emphasize that we're not doing this alone. The City of Los Angeles is part of a national BPS coalition organized by the White House, which is a group of state and local governments committed to inclusively designing and implementing BPS policies and programs. And this was launched by President Biden recently. It's still getting started, and it's in alignment with the Justice 40 policy or priorities. The timing for the major milestones for our goals is laid out in LA's Green New Deal Climate Action Plan. And these are the milestones kind of noted on this chart for new buildings and existing buildings. And along the bottom, there are our energy efficiency goals. And policy, whenever completed, usually includes interim milestones as steps along that pathway to goals, maybe in 1-year update cycles, like our current energy benchmarking allows for, maybe in 3-year cycles, like Kristen was mentioning, our state energy code, maybe in 5-year cycles, like our broader EBEW policy. Different cities choose different things for different reasons. And so I just wanted to share 2 examples of building performance standards recently passed in Denver and New York. Denver's covers efficiency metrics, while New York's covers carbon. They both cover buildings over 25,000 square feet, which they consider to be large buildings, but there are far more of these buildings in New York than in Denver. In New York, these large buildings cover 60% of their total building area, so even more than they would make up here in LA in that building size. And I think for that reason, Denver also opted to include smaller buildings with an alternative compliance measure. And they can choose, these smaller buildings can choose to take specific energy saving actions instead of complying with specific efficiency metrics. So for those of you asking about hard to decarbonize buildings in the chat, what about older buildings? What about unusual buildings? This kind of alternative compliance mechanism is a way to emphasize change where it's possible without having unrealistic or inequitable expectations. They both have major milestones of 2030. Denver uses 3-year steps, New York uses 1-year steps, and Denver sets their compliance limits according to individual building, and New York sets their limits according to building category. I'm going to explain more about that in the next 2 slides. So here is a visual example of Denver's milestones according to individual buildings, and they're measuring energy efficiency, or EUI. And these 3 buildings start at 3 different points: the least efficient building on the top line, the most efficient building on the bottom line. Everybody's aiming for the same final point, but the least efficient blue building has to make changes that are deeper in those 2 interim goal points. If you're a most efficient building on the gray line, maybe you take one action early on and you've already hit your final target. Maybe you wait until later and take action later. Next slide. This is more complicated, so I'm going to walk people through this chart. This is an example of targets across a building category. And this example shows how different sets of buildings within a category could take action to meet different performance levels. So this chart is showing energy efficiency levels, or EUI in multifamily buildings. And each full column on this chart represents buildings that have the same energy use intensity. The columns are split into 2 colors because blue is electric energy and yellow is natural gas energy. The columns toward the left that are tallest and have the highest energy intensity are the least energy efficient. The columns toward the right that are shorter are the most energy efficient in this multifamily category. And the horizontal line in the middle, the straight gray line, is the median. Half the buildings are worse than this performance level and half are better. If we wanted all buildings in this multifamily category to meet the median efficiency target, all the buildings on the left would have to take action to reduce their EUI to meet that gray line. The buildings on the right wouldn't have to do anything. And if we aim for deeper efficiency goals, like in the other horizontal lines, the dotted blue line or the dotted green line, more buildings would have to take action to reach those lines and improve their performance and their carbon reductions in a deeper way. So we could imagine that maybe the gray line is a first milestone, the blue line is a second milestone, the green line is a final milestone. So different buildings within this category would take action at different times, depending on their relative position to the line. Next. As Kristen mentioned about studies of cost impacts, there have been multiple studies of costs for building retrofits that look at both upfront costs and utility bill impacts of electrification measures. And so a couple studies by Arup Engineering and by Energy and Environmental Economics, it covered several types of buildings. As before, these studies are very complex, they're very detailed. So the following slide is a broad summary of complex results. I just want to hope to establish some trends. Next. So in different categories, we see different results. In non-residential buildings, a retrofit is typically going to reduce energy bills, usually enough to recover the upfront costs. In single family and low-rise multifamily buildings, it really depends on whether there's already air conditioning or cooling in the building before it gets retrofitted. If there's already cooling in the building, energy bills are reduced, typically enough to recover upfront costs 85% of the time. If there was no cooling before, and by doing a retrofit, you not only improve efficiency and decarbonize, but you also add cooling, you're using more energy in that building, in which case your energy bills might reduce or they might go up if your new cooling increases demand. And that's usually not enough to recover all of the upfront costs. I also want to note that in a hot climate like Los Angeles, cooling becomes increasingly important as a resilience measure and as a public health measure. So in terms of the benefits and costs of doing this kind of retrofit, I just want to name that for some people, for some buildings, cooling actually is a literal lifesaver. And I also acknowledge that the chronic costs can be difficult to bear as well. In multifamily buildings, retrofits generally result in energy bills being reduced, but usually not enough to recover all the upfront costs. I also want to note that some of these issues are going to be covered in much greater detail next week by some of the people who are much better qualified to answer questions on this. So if you have questions and we don't get to them, please come back next week. Next slide. Similar considerations as what Kristen mentioned. What about EV charging, on-site renewables? How about embodied carbon? How are we going to cooperate with the county? And most importantly, how will we accommodate and support buildings where cost savings are not enough to cover upfront investments? What kinds of penalties might there be for non-compliance? And if so, how will those penalty fees be used by the city in service of the mission? Next slide. In closing, policy models today are relevant examples, but I hope we're thinking about which of them resonate with you. If they were applied in LA, how would you be affected? And what kind of support or tools would you need to go through this transition?
Thank you, Megan and Kristen. I really appreciate that. I guess I'm going to bring up some of the questions from the session, and you all feel free to, I guess I'll ask the first one. Why does natural gas have to go? From a question above, it seems that the next presentation has clearly made the case about natural gas has to go, and it has to go 100%, because as long as there are gas appliances, even in a small minority of buildings, there will be a demand to maintain the gas supply service for the entire building. The end game will be rough. That question is, it's more of a comment, really. That question is from Dean. But I guess the question could be phrased is that what we're expecting to happen? That as we transition, some homes will transition within a building and some won't, and it's just going to make it harder to create a diminishing cost of returns, which means make it more efficient economically and more efficient from an energy perspective.
I can take this unless Kristen wants to. The issue with natural gas, which is truly fossil gas, is it's a carbon central fuel. And to reduce carbon emissions, there's really no place for a carbon centric fuel in a carbon free world. And so we have so many tools at our disposal for carbon reduced and carbon free energy sources. And we are taking all of as many actions as we can, with as much integration as we can. And the point about decommissioning the gas system is going to come up 2 weeks from now, actually, because some of the jobs impacts really focus on who manages and maintains those systems, and how do we both sustain jobs through transition as well as manage the transition effectively. So it's not meant to punt the question, but really meant to say that, utility planning at the local municipal level for our municipal, for DWP, as well as at the state level, the state has a really big role that they're playing in holding investor-owned utilities accountable for how they plan to transition away from carbon-centric fuels. But I hope that we can, take action locally in coordination with the state to ensure that we're using as many carbon-free solutions as soon as possible as we can.
Only thing I'd add to that is we're obviously here to talk about climate today. It's in the title, but at the county, we're the public health department, and there's a lot of indoor air quality and outdoor air quality issues that are, adjacent to the climate emissions issues, but there's a lot of indoor air quality considerations as well. And from a public health perspective, that's another important consideration.
Great. Yeah, I think considering the indoor public health considerations is part of the cost that people bear, that they might not put, with dollar signs, but if they have to, go to the doctor, get hospitalized, they suffer indoor air and outdoor air, especially during the summer months when there's a lot of smoke and there's a lot of heat. The costs that we bear are multiplied by the negative health experiences in the low income community. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, Kristen. The next question is, or comment, in the last presentation, Megan mentioned that commercial buildings were more electric. So it's surprising that non-residential electric is less expensive to construct than other usage types. Is that because it's industrial?
Not sure what an industrial aspect would have to do with it, but essentially the reason why it's cheaper to construct all electric buildings from the get-go versus mixed fuel is because you're essentially, you're essentially omitting an infrastructure type, or you're omitting a certain type of connection in that building. Instead of installing two things, you're installing one thing. So that does generally reduce costs.
Well, thank you all so much. I'd like to stay here asking you more questions, but I think I need to transition into the small group breakouts to get more input from our target audience. Thank you all so very much. That was really helpful and enlightening, and it's going to cause a lot of great conversation in our small groups. Andres, it's all yours.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you. So now we'll be going into breakout rooms for about 20 minutes or so. Each breakout room will have a pre-designated facilitator and note taker who will guide each room through three kind of main questions. And I'll paste the questions in the chat. Your facilitators will also have access to these questions, but just to reiterate, the first question is, in your view, what are some of the benefits of building decarbonization, or also just clean energy buildings? Second question is, what are some of the challenges related to building decarbonization, such as like transitioning to clean energy buildings? And the last question is, what are some things that could be done to make building decarbonization more equitable for you and your community? And you can take the rest of the time, particularly for that last question. I will introduce this concept called the bike rack. I think some of the facilitators are familiar with it. If you want to bring something up that may not be necessarily a priority around building decarb, we do ask facilitators and note takers to maybe put on the bike rack as a tool that we use to kind of address things on the back end, maybe offline or at a later session that we can later bring up or address via email. So I just want to share that. Also, if there are any Spanish speakers here that need to be in a Spanish breakout rooms, please write it in the chat. I hope Andres and Luis as interpreters are communicating that. And I can also just see on the chat if anything comes up. And with that, I think we can open up some of the breakout rooms, Ray, and I'm going to share the questions in the chat right now. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. We will be back around like 7:45, 7:47. Excellent. I think I see Pilar, Araceli, Marta, Megan, Michelle, Rebecca are all here. Is that correct? Hey, Araceli and Pilar, so sorry about that. Apologies. I guess none of the Spanish speakers that had registered had arrived today. I'm going to pause the recording for a moment. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. I believe we have everyone back into the main room. I know we are getting close to time, so I'm just going to ask if some facilitators can share. Mato, would you mind starting us off and just kind of what were the main takeaways? And just a reminder, if you can avoid naming anybody specifically, just kind of general takeaways that came up in your room.
Sure, maybe I could start with the first question, which was around what are the benefits of building decarbonization? There are many benefits of building decarbonization, including improving indoor air quality and mitigating air pollution in communities. Building decarbonization can also protect public safety, especially for communities that have been adversely impacted by Southern California gas storage facilities and worry all the time about gas explosions. There are also benefits to reduce carbon and greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to global warming and climate change. Other benefits include utility rates in a just transition, so lowering utility rates and making renewable energy resources more affordable, where benefits go directly to burdened communities. Some of the challenges that folks talked about include cost being passed down to owners and tenants. A lot of folks were concerned about how tenants will be impacted. We heard stories about how landlords used eviction tactics to harass tenants, and a lot of folks are just worried that building decarb programs and initiatives can be used as a harassment tactic to kick out tenants. So that was one major concern that was brought up. Another concern was around just how homes who share electric grids that have transferred to using solar panels on their homes can be impacted by building decarb policies. Will the electricity provided from solar and wind, for example, be sufficient for energy use? Some of the, let's see, the last question were, what are some things that could be done to make building decarb more equitable in the community? Folks brought up the need for more information hotlines, anything that can be distributed to people that are asking for help. People are asking for help. They want to learn more about what's out there, what's available, and there are just not enough resources to share with community. So that was one thing that was brought up. Another was around grants that can create jobs that cultivate on the ground community education. And then of course, the crisis of utility, affordability, and just overall concerns about cost as well. And then also the need for pilot programs that are inclusive of community feedback from residents and ensuring that that feedback is integrated into any policy and program related to building decarb.
Thank you so much, Maro. Really appreciate that. And shout out to Rhonda. Much appreciate the resource. Already looking at it, super interesting. If folks have anything they want to share too in the chat, feel free. I know we're pressed for time. I think I'm going to ask one more person. Cameron, would you mind kind of sharing a little bit your facilitation room or your breakout room a little bit? What were some of the key takeaways?
Yes, of course, and good evening, everybody. Some of the benefits that our group came up with were potentially reduced costs, less release of indoor air pollutants from the burning of natural gas, which could lead to public health benefits. Something that was brought up was that with children in particular, there was concerns about the climate and the effect on children, because at certain schools where there's, for example, oil drilling or other sorts of pollutants nearby, they have headaches and issues with learning, not feeling good, and that sort of thing. So also we brought up that communities of color feel the effects of carbon emissions much higher than what they produce. So ideally with building decarbonization, some of these issues some of these disparities will go away. It was also brought up that with wildfires across the area, solar panels on multi-unit buildings can help with energy resilience. With challenges, it was brought up that there's been pushback from people within the development community about decarb leading to higher building costs. People believing that it could be so high that it becomes prohibitive to building. Also that reaching the most disadvantaged households as well as struggling businesses that are important to the local economy of these communities was another challenge, as well as the challenges of retrofitting existing buildings, especially that there could be challenges in the retrofits, especially with pre-1978 buildings, which have to be very invasive. They can be 50 to 70-year-old electric systems. Interacting with lead paint is another challenge, as well as asbestos. But it was brought up that in the tenant habitability plan, tenants can be relocated during the retrofit, but finding an apartment within LA is, of course, difficult. And then as far as how to make the process more equitable, one of the comments that was actually seconded as well was, don't make tenants pay for it. Of course, because renting in LA is incredibly expensive. Many people are behind on rent. Of course, gas prices are soaring over $6 per gallon. And we need to consider the housing market and minimum wage in these kinds of things, saying that incentive funding should be prioritized toward low-income households. They should be prioritized, as well as making sure that any programs or policies that come out are going to reach the communities of color and disadvantaged communities. Programs have to be accessible. People shouldn't feel hesitant to apply. And it was brought up particularly with Latino communities. Someone voiced hesitancy and the possible distrust to communicate with government agencies for different reasons, and bringing up that the most vulnerable communities must be front and center in mind.
Thank you so much, Cameron. Really appreciate those points. Also, thank you, Megan, for the additional resources. I think since I see we're at 7:53, and Martha, if it's okay with you, as well as Ray, I think maybe it would be good if we can kind of move into the Mentimeter as well. Ray, I don't know if you, perfect. So for folks who aren't familiar, Menti is a way to kind of, get polling, get people's different ideas on. And this is an open-ended Mentimeter. I'm going to share the link right now in the chat. If you go into also menti.com and use the code 49341528, we just asked, what were the takeaways that came out from today? What did you hear from somebody in your breakout room? What really stood out to you? Solutions, challenges. Feel free to populate this in English or Spanish. Also, if you don't feel comfortable using Menti and you just want to put in the Zoom chat, that's perfectly fine as well. Whatever medium works best for you. We just thought this would be another way that folks could kind of see any responses come up. Already seeing something, kind of everything that Myron and Cameron summarized. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so if you can, write any notes, if you want to write any notes in the chat. I know we're getting close to time, but, just thought it would be good to kind of get any takeaways that really stood out to you. Cool. So I'm just going to see some as improving air quality as a major priority, the need to protect frontline communities, tenants should not be bearing that cost, solutions to reducing GHG. Yes, keep it coming, y'all. Incentivizing funding for low-income communities first. Healthy homes are necessary, as well as tenants protections during that process. Excellent. You see, so as folks kind of start populating, the Menti will just kind of keep scrolling. I see Yvonne, the importance of not leaving anyone behind. Appreciate that point. So I think we're seeing a recurring theme around need for inclusivity. See a note from Louis Chase, indoor air quality. Need to keep that in mind with any decarbonization process. So please feel free to keep populating. I know we're at 7:55, so I will be returning this to Marta, but this Menti will be open. We ask, in these last couple of minutes for y'all to kind of put down any thoughts, and we'll be also sharing this as well. And, it'll help us kind of see what were the key takeaways from this first workshop. Yeah, thank you so much, y'all. I really appreciate you all as we kind of go through this for the first time, and I hope you have a beautiful and blessed night. Marta, are you?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you, Andres. Thank you, everyone who facilitated and took notes and was ready to share back their comments. And I just want to assure everybody that the comments from the breakout sessions will be conserved and used for our final report for the commission. So please know that everything that you've offered, everything that you've said will be used for making recommendations and findings to our Equitable Climate Action Roadmap. And we will also be finding a way to ensure the questions that you've asked are responded to, and we will come up with a mechanism for that when we email you back with the recording and the PDF. The other thing that I wanted to say is I wanted to thank everybody who participated, who came here tonight, who registered, who was in our design team committee, from the council members to the tenants who have been a big part of this. I want to thank you for your energy, for your time, for your inspiration. We're here for you. We're here because of you, and we're excited for this model to work with your participation, your input. I want to make sure that Ray puts up the flyer, so I can remind you that there's 3 more sessions on the decarbonization of buildings and homes that are going to focus on workforce development, that are going to focus more on housing justice, that are going to focus more on how we pay for and finance building decarbonization and other climate policies. And we will continue to gain insight from your wisdom, from your participation. And we will send you the dates again if you don't have them. Oh, there it is. Thank you, Ray. So the dates are right in front of us. March 10th, March 17th, and March 24th are the next 2 sessions. And then I wanted to alert you to part 2 and part 3 on community climate adaptation and resilience and climate equity metrics and view, a finale. And those will go through May 26th. I know it's a very packed schedule from now to the end of May, but we're not just educating, we're not just sharing information, we're taking information from you to ensure that our Climate Emergency Mobilization Commission and our council has your ideas, has your concepts, and they're integrated into helping to shape equitable climate policy that is affordable for all. So thank you once again, everybody, for your energy and time. It was a pleasure being with you. It's an honor being with you, and we will see you next week.
Beautiful night. And 1 minute to spare. Nice.
Wow.